that speaks a better word than the blood of Abel. The image is arresting and somewhat unexpected. If, as the writer elsewhere argues, Christ's work was to undo the damage done by Adam's sin and to restore humanity to its intended place as God's viceroy in creation, then might we not have expected salvation to be pictured under the image of a garden, as paradise regained, rather than as a city, a complex human organization which is viewed negatively in certain biblical traditions? Think of the first city of biblical history, Babel. I think there is a reason for this. The writer to the Hebrews does not view the end of history as simply going back to the beginning, but as transcending it. Implicit here is a sense that everything that happened between the fall and the consummation was not a total waste of time. The final state will acknowledge to some degree human achievement based on God's creation ordinance to humanity to work, la'avod, his world. That is to say, to develop the potential he has put in it, to be God's co-creator. The final blessed state of humanity will acknowledge to some degree that work. The city of God embraces both heaven and earth. It unites humans and angels. It unites the assembly of the firstborn, that is, those who have been redeemed since the coming of Christ, the firstborn of many brethren and sisters, and the saints of the old covenant who looked forward in hope and faith to the coming of Christ, that is, the spirits of the righteous made perfect. God, the judge of all, is enthroned within the city, but his relationship to its inhabitants is mediated through Christ, whose perfect sacrifice constitutes its founding charter, whose blood perpetually calls out for forgiveness and atonement, unlike the blood of Abel, which called for vengeance. The city, therefore, cannot be brought to ruin by human sin. The city is depicted as in festal array, as celebrating a holiday. This is how our author represents the beatific vision. What we will do in the final redeemed state is a question which theologians, following Paul's lead, have tended to shy away from. Eye has not seen nor ear heard what God has prepared for those who love him. But there is a problem here, which is well caught by the English philosopher Bernard Williams when he speaks of the tedium of immortality. How can human beings, with all the restless creativity with which God has endowed them, spend happily an eternity of bliss? Our author points towards at least a partial answer. We should picture ourselves as involved in worship, and not just individual contemplation of God, but in communal worship, involving ourselves, the Old Testament saints, and the angels. He hints that we can already here on earth begin to anticipate that blessed state in our worship. This is only a glimpse, but a vivid one. And it is all the more vivid if he is envisaging the worship on earth as already joining with the worship of the angels in heaven. This idea was already well established in Jewish thought in his day. Its most striking expression is found in the songs of the Sabbath sacrifice from Qumran, a series of hymns which were originally sung by the Levitical choirs in the Jerusalem temple to accompany the special Sabbath sacrifice. They visualize humanity on earth joining the worship of the angels in heaven in a single yachad, a united worshiping community. The Qumran sectarians, when they seceded from the temple, took these songs with them and made them part of their liturgy. They ceased offering animal sacrifices, but instead offered praise, the offering of the lips. And in doing so, they approached more closely the worship of the angels, for there is no animal sacrifices in heaven. Similar ideas were taken up in the synagogue liturgy, in the prayers known as Kiddushot, and of course in the liturgy of the church, most notably in the Eucharist. Therefore, with angels and with archangels and all the company of heaven, we laud and magnify, etc. This anticipation of the eschaton, here and now, is hinted at elsewhere in our passage. The city of God is in heaven, but we are on earth. Note, however, that we have already come to the heavenly city. The perfect tense of the verb is unequivocal. What this means is spelled out, I suggest, in the phrase enrolled in heaven. We are enrolled already as citizens of the heavenly Jerusalem and are thus living on earth as strangers, as resident aliens, in Greek terms metics, or in Hebrew terms gerim. This immediately calls to mind Galatians 4:26. The Jerusalem above is free, and she is our mother. That is to say, our metropolis. Just as Philo of Alexandria could see Jerusalem as the mother city of the far-flung Jewish diaspora, so we Christians on earth are the diaspora of the heavenly Jerusalem, into which we shall be gathered at the end of history. Hebrews 12 also recalls Philippians 3:20. Our citizenship, polytuma, is in heaven, and we eagerly await a Savior from there. Note the echoing of the language of an imperial visitation, which was called a parousia in Greek. I find it hard to believe that the author of Hebrews did not know one or both of these passages. The verbal echoes may not be strong, but the congruence of ideas, and the ideas are not all that obvious, is striking. Though we haven't the time here to dwell on the implications of these passages for the Christians' involvement in politics, that they do have political implications, we should note in passing, because the political reference will become important for our argument later. For Hebrews, the city of God is in heaven, and it is already peopled by angels, by the Old Testament saints, and by those believers in Christ who have already died. It is steadily filling up as believers pass beyond the veil and join in the heavenly festival. But is this city destined to remain in heaven? Is that its final location? Here we touch on one of the ticklish problems, the most ticklish problems of Christian and indeed Jewish theology. The problem of what I call the double eschaton, or the double end. Now, I will need a little time to unpack this, but it is important to my argument, so please bear with me. As I've argued elsewhere, Christian eschatology, and indeed before it, Jewish and Zoroastrian eschatology, and after it, Islamic eschatology, seems paradoxically to posit a double end to history. To formulate this from the Christian perspective, this means that the soul, after death, departs into the spirit world, there to enjoy either the bliss of heaven or the punishments of hell. But then, after a period of time, it is reunited with its body in the resurrection of the dead, raised back to life, judged, and once again assigned to either bliss or torment. You see, it's double. Why do this twice? Wouldn't either eschaton be a sufficient climax to the process of redemption? This tension, this anomaly, has been acutely felt in the history of Christian thought. And this can be seen in the tendency within Christian thought to eliminate or strongly downplay one of these eschatons. For example, some, particularly those influenced by Platonic ideas, see the post-mortem state as the end and take the resurrection to apply to the ascent of the soul to God. So very often when you see on tombs Re Surgam, I will rise, it probably is not referring to physical resurrection at the end of history, but to the ascent of the soul to God. Others, following more closely biblical teaching, play up the resurrection of the body at the end of history and play down the post-mortem state as one of soul sleep, that is, as one of unconsciousness. The soul is oblivious to pleasure or pain till awakened and reunited with its body in the resurrection at the end of history. This view has been recently championed, if I get it right, by my good friend Tom Wright. Christian tradition, and indeed Jewish and Zoroastrian and Muslim tradition, however, firmly and unequivocally embraces both ends, and for very good theological reasons, which I cannot go into here. To focus on the matter in hand, it looks on the face of it that Hebrews advocates only a post-mortem eschaton. Our destiny is to ascend, whether after death, or perhaps if we're alive at the Parousia physically, to the heavenly Jerusalem, and there live an eternal life of disembodied bliss. That is how Hebrews is usually read, but I do not think that this is correct. We need to take seriously our author's claim that there are many things which he would have liked to have said, but couldn't. He concentrated narrowly on the pastoral problem at hand, and that was to present his Christian readers with incontrovertible reasons for not turning back to Judaism. A return to the synagogue would be contrary to God's manifest purpose in history, but there are clear hints of his broader position. This was the question that came up at the end of when Peter asked, is Hebrews more or less a self-sufficient statement of the gospel? It's not. It's part of a broader, and this is why the church puts it as part of the whole of the New Testament. And the author of it hints that there's a whole lot of things he couldn't talk about because he hadn't the time, they couldn't understand it, or it didn't really address the issue that was in front of him. So one of the things that I think you've got to be careful about is reading too literally and restrictively the idea that he sees the end as being the heavenly Jerusalem. If he isn't being self-sufficient here, then I think it raises the possibility that he could have believed that the heavenly Jerusalem, in effect, would come down to earth at the end of history, exactly like it's depicted as doing in his near contemporaries writing, the author of Revelation. You remember in Revelation that the heavenly Jerusalem comes down to earth. I don't think that Hebrews would have objected to that idea. And in fact, it would fit in with his doctrine of creation and salvation. He certainly looks for a second coming of Christ he says this. So, I mean, I don't want to go into that in any detail here. But what this means is, it reinforces the idea that Hebrews has not abandoned the historical political process here on earth, but is actually engaged in addressing it. Our author is taking up a very precise and nuanced position within the politics of his day. I have argued this at length elsewhere, but let me summarize here the key points of my arguments. Let us consider the Jewish politics of his day. We believe, as Loveday said earlier, there are good grounds for thinking that Hebrews was written in the 80s of the first century, and that it was addressed to Christians in Rome. In other words, it postdates the destruction of the temple and the city of Jerusalem by the Romans in 70. This period in Jewish politics is often misunderstood, and it is often assumed that the Jews had got such a drubbing from the Romans that all the nationalist ardor had been knocked out of them. Maybe it had in the case of some, but there is good evidence to suggest that nationalism, what you might call zealotry, still flourished in some quarters. Zealots, fleeing the debacle in the land, caused trouble in various diaspora communities. In Alexandria, in the immediate aftermath of the war, again in Alexandria and Cyrenaica, in Cyprus and Mesopotamia, in the years 115 to 117, and finally back in the homeland in 132, 135 under Bar Kokhba. These nationalists believed that the fall of Jerusalem was only a temporary setback. God was about to intervene dramatically in history, defeat the Romans, and restore his ancient city. The symbol of the redemption in these movements became a new Jerusalem, already existing in heaven, poised to descend to earth and replace the ruins of the old city. And this is what you get explicitly stated in the two extant apocalypses from this period, the end of the first century, the fourth book of Ezra and the second book of Baruch. Now just pause on that. This is the background against which you've got to read Hebrews 12, the heavenly Jerusalem. For Ezra, writing at the same time, says, yes, there's a heavenly Jerusalem. It's going to come down to earth. 2 Baruch is saying the same thing. Hebrews then, seen in this historical context, turns out to be a much more political document than we might suppose. I skipped a bit there, which I really must put in. Because there's another city that plays a part in the politics of this period, and that is the city of Rome. The Jewish texts of 4 Ezra and 2 Baruch are clearly setting up the new Jerusalem against the city of Rome. There's a competition between these two cities, Rome and Jerusalem. There's no room, implies 4 Ezra and 2 Baruch, for the two cities in the purposes of God in history. The rise of the one entails the fall of the other. Symbolizing Jewish liberation by the city of Jerusalem pushed back against Roman imperial propaganda of this period, which increasingly presented the city of Rome as symbolizing the Roman Imperium. That city was personified as a female goddess, Roma Diva or Roma Eterna, and statues of her were erected all over the empire and received civic veneration from time to time. We need to set Hebrews' heavenly Jerusalem in this context. And when we do so, it becomes clear that it is rejecting the Jewish nationalist vision of the New Jerusalem, but also probably rejecting the imperium of Roma Eterna. That anti-Roman stance comes out very clearly in the book of Revelation, which was written probably around 10 years after Hebrews. Okay, so there's a rich context here, political context, against which you've got to read the heavenly Jerusalem of Romans 12. That's the historical background. Hebrews then, seen in its historical context, turns out to be a much more political document than we might at first sight suppose. Now, the situation which it addresses is uncannily similar to our own, which gives it an astonishing relevance and immediacy. We must be careful not to draw facile and indeed false analogies between the past and the present, but it is equally improper, particularly in the interpretation of an authoritative religious text, to grandly dismiss the analogies when they jump up and hit us in the face. Hebrew implicitly critiques the Roman imperialism of its day, and this surely has much to say to us about the imperialism of our own day. The America under Trump, for example. For Rome, read America. It would equally, by the way, have had much to say about British imperialism when Britain was an imperial power. But that is not the aspect of the Hebrews message that I want to focus on today, but rather on its implicit critique of Jewish nationalism. We have witnessed a powerful upsurge of Jewish nationalism in our own time, with the founding after 2,000 years, once again, of an independent Jewish state. Zionism, the ideology which underpins the founding of the State of Israel, is one of the most powerful ideologies of our times, an ideology which has transformed Judaism and is playing a leading part in the world today. It is a time of Zionism. What, I ask, does it mean to read Hebrews in a time of Zionism? What guidance can Hebrews give to Christians struggling to cope with the challenge of Jewish nationalism? Zionism itself, interestingly, encourages drawing such a comparison, since it sees itself as standing in continuity with its ancient biblical and post-biblical past. It valorizes not only the great periods when, for example, under King David and King Solomon, or under the Maccabees, it enjoyed some degree of sovereignty over the land of Israel. But freedom fighters like the zealots of the First Revolt against Rome in 66 to 74, or Bar Kokhba, the leader of the Second Revolt of 132 to 135, are heroes of the present state of Israel, even though both revolts ended in catastrophic failure. To give just one small example out of many as to how the distant past looms over the present in Israel, I will take the poem Masada by the modern Hebrew poet Isaac Lamdan. He died in 1954, he's long dead. Now, Masada is the great Herodian fortress on the western shore of the Dead Sea. Has anyone been there? I'm sure some people have been there. Yep, you know, it's spectacular. A great fortress built by Herod on the western shore of the Dead Sea, where the Sicarii, that is the knife men, an extremist nationalist group of Jewish assassins, made their last stand against the Romans in 74, at the end of the First Revolt. According to Josephus, when it became clear that the besieging Romans would finally break in, the Roman siege works are visible to this day, the Sicarii committed mass suicide rather than submit to Rome and be sold as slaves. Now, Lamdan took Masada as a symbol of modern Israel, besieged by her enemies. His use of the symbolism is in fact subtle. He is as concerned as much by the possibility that Israel, modern Israel, may become a trap and lead to the destruction of the Jewish people, as by the possibility that it will become a refuge and a salvation. But secular Zionist propaganda has spun his poem in a totally positive way. Moshe Dayan, when defense minister, inaugurated the practice of units of the Israel Defense Forces being sworn in on Masada. At the end of the dramatic ceremony held by torchlight, which involved a night ascent to the top of the hill, up the spectacular slate path, and a torchlight procession, it concluded with the troops proclaiming in unison the most famous line from Lamdan's poem, which in Hebrew is, Shenit Masada lo tipol. Masada will not fall a second time. And in fact, that's inscribed at Masada itself. As you go into the entrance hall, there it is. It's hard for those of us who live outside Israel to realize how much Israeli Jews are encouraged to live in the biblical landscape, to identify that landscape with stories from the biblical past. Much of the old Arabic names have been erased from the map and replaced by biblical names, where these can be identified, or by modern Hebrew names where they cannot. In the present conflict, Gaza resonates loudly with biblical references. The homeland of the Philistines, Israel's ancient and implacable foe. The place where the ancient Israelite strongman, Samson, brought the temple of Dagon crashing down on the heads of the Philistines. And these allusions are constantly played upon in political discourse and popular culture. There's a load of pop songs about Samson in Israel at the moment. I mean, it's funny in some ways, but it's chilling in others. There's a tendency in classical secular Zionism to downplay Jewish history between the last brief Jewish commonwealth in the land under Bar Kokhba in 135 and today. Classical secular Zionism is deeply negative about this period of Jewish history. It is seen as a time of subservience to foreign powers and cultures, for the most part lived outside the land, with little or no attempt on the part of Jews to throw off the yoke and return to re-establish their ancient homeland. This is the period of what they call galut, exile. And galut is not just an objective condition of subservience, but a subjective state of mind. It engendered a false consciousness, a mentality which passively accepted the condition of subservience and which tainted all the institutions, literature, and worldview that originated in exile, in the galut. It would be hard to overestimate. Getting a frog in my throat. I'm not used to lecturing like this now, since I've retired. And you forget how much it strains the vocal cords. It would be hard to overestimate the extent to which this worldview has permeated the politics of the State of Israel. It was deliberately and very effectively fostered by David Ben-Gurion, the charismatic first prime minister of the State of Israel. But Ben-Gurion was a deeply secular Jew who had no time for traditional Judaism. But he did see the importance of the Tanakh, the Hebrew Bible, our Old Testament, to the nascent Jewish state. He saw the Bible as the title deeds of the Jews to the land. As Jews from all over the world began to flood into Israel in the 1950s, they brought with them very different languages and cultures, and even views of Judaism. He was fearful for the unity of the new state. He was worried that the historic Jewish tendency towards factionalism and tribalism would prevent it from ever cohering into a single nation. He set about creating a national culture. Propagated through national service, everyone had to serve in the army who was fit, and the state educational system, and by the policies and pronouncements of the government. Above all, by making Hebrew the official language of the state. And all this advanced a Zionist view of Jewish history. A melting pot was created which would fuse the diverse peoples into one. Into the pot, the diverse Jewish immigrants would go, and out of it they would come as Israelis, a totally new sort of Jew who had not been seen for 2,000 years. Central to the whole process was the Bible. And for Ben-Gurion, central to the Bible was not, as in traditional Judaism, the Torah of Moses, but the book of Joshua, which tells the story of the first Israelite conquest of the land. Many outsiders, indeed many Jews, totally fail to understand how innovative and revolutionary secular Zionism was. So central has Zionism become in the eyes of many to Jewish life. Zionism has not only created a new type of Jew, it has created a new Judaism, a fact which is recognized by Zionist thinkers as diverse as Yossi Stein, who's very right-wing, and Yaakov Yadgar, who is very left-wing. Stein celebrates this transformation of Judaism. Yadgar rather disapproves of it, or at least is conscious of the problems it creates for Zionism's claim to Jewish legitimacy. Secular Zionism has a big problem with traditional Judaism, and the tension between the two has created a culture war within Israel, which has threatened at times to tear the state apart. It's threatening to tear it apart at the moment. The nub of the problem is that traditional Judaism has its own form of Zionism. It too looks forward to the return at the end of history of the Jewish people to their land in sovereignty. Jews have prayed for this daily in the great statutory prayer, the 18 benedictions, or Amidah. The Passover Seder meal ends with the acclamation, "Next year in Jerusalem." When the secular Zionists began to return to Palestine and start building the infrastructure of a Jewish state, when they finally declared sovereignty in 1948, and since then expanded their control over the land, including the whole territory between the river and the sea, traditional Jews were faced with a challenge. Is this the redemption for which we have prayed and longed in all the centuries of our exile? One traditional Jewish response to this question was a resounding no. This rejection of secular Zionism by traditional Jews goes all the way back to the beginnings of secular Zionism in the late 19th century and continues down to the present day. These rejectionists are now a small and fringe minority, even within the traditional camp, but their position is well rooted within Jewish tradition. According to that tradition, it would be the Messiah who would inaugurate the return to Zion and the re-establishment of a sovereign Jewish state at the end of history. Jews should not try to do it themselves, but wait patiently for the coming of the Messiah in God's good time. The only practical action they should take towards bringing about this state was faithfully to keep the Torah, and thereby perhaps hasten the end. But to force the redemption is a serious sin, and the secular Zionists were blatantly guilty of it. Some traditionalists, however, have reached an accommodation with the secular Zionist state. They include now ultra-Orthodox Jews who traditionally formed the mainstay of religious opposition to secular Zionism. These and other Jewish religious Zionists are very active now in Israeli politics. Indeed, they are propping up in government the right-wing secular Zionist Likud party of Benjamin Netanyahu. For religious Zionists, Talmud, Midrash, codes remain absolutely central and inform the political program which they try to implement in real terms in everyday life in Israel today. They are unshakable, for example, in their attempts to annex the West Bank, because they believe that it is an integral part of the land which was given as an inalienable inheritance to the ancestors of the Jewish people, and they form the core of the settler movement. Right-wing secular Zionists also want to annex the West Bank, but the difference between them and religious Zionists comes out not in the objective to annex the West Bank, but in the reasons they give to justify such a move. Secular Zionists appeal to realpolitik, such as security or a historic claim to the land, going all the way back to biblical times, whereas religious Zionists, though they may also cite such arguments, ultimately rely on the claim that God has given the land as an inalienable heritage to the ancestors of the Jews. Now, I've spent a lot of time in Zionism. You might well be thinking, this started off in Hebrews, and how have we gone into this little survey of Zionist history? But I think it's terribly important that Christians know some of this stuff, because you can't begin to understand what you see on television at the moment without knowing a lot of this. So it's very important for Christians to make themselves aware of these things. I've spent some time on Zionism for a very good reason, because Zionism is today the most powerful theology in Judaism, which has totally transformed Judaism. This is now being recognized by scholars as diverse as Yaakov Yadgar and Yossi Schein. Some speak of the Israelization of Judaism. The present state of Israel has become so central to Jewish self-identification that to reject it is now seen as ipso facto and anti-Semitic. It is absolutely essential that Christians should take time to understand Zionism so that they can formulate nuanced responses to the current Middle East crisis and enter into informed dialogue with Jewish people. Israel is now the elephant in the room in every encounter today with the Jewish people. And this brings me back to Hebrews, because the writer to the Hebrews, as I argued earlier, addressed a situation not dissimilar to our own. He lived at a time of great national turmoil for the Jewish people. The disastrous war of 66 to 74, which led to the destruction of the Jerusalem temple and the expulsion of the Jews from Judea, and the selling of thousands of them into slavery, did not, as I said earlier, snuff out nationalist fervor. Significant numbers, to recap, viewed this as a temporary setback. God would intervene dramatically, defeat Rome, and restore Jerusalem and the temple. And one of the most potent symbols of this redemption was the idea that a new Jerusalem already existed in heaven, and that soon it would come down to earth to occupy the site of the destroyed city, and all the exiles would flow back into it. The writer of Hebrews' heavenly Jerusalem, which, as I have argued, he may also have envisaged descending to earth at the end of history, has been constructed precisely to negate the nationalist Zionism of post-70 Judaism. The author of the Hebrews was, I take it, looking for a return of Christ to earth to found his kingdom, a state which he symbolized under the image of a new heavenly Jerusalem. And he doubtless believed that that kingdom would involve the overthrow of Rome. But it would be built on very different foundations from the new Jerusalem envisaged by the Jewish nationalists of this day, and there was no way that Christians could support that nationalist cause. This immediately raises the questions about the relationship of the church to Zionism today. In my view, it problematizes church support for Zionists in its nationalist, militant form. Does this mean that a Christian cannot support the state of Israel? I would argue not. I would regard myself as a passionate supporter of the right of the Jewish people to live in peace and security. And if the best way for them to do that is in their own state, then so be it. But the grounds on which I would argue that would be general, moral, and political. They would be grounds I would happily apply to all other peoples of the world. I would find it difficult in the light of Hebrews to argue that the Jewish people as a nation state has any particular role to play in the purposes of God. I would find it difficult to discern in the founding of the state of Israel any signs of the specific purposes of God. It is possible to argue that continued Jewish statehood may now be the best way of solving the current problems of the Middle East, and I would prepare to do so. Whatever view one takes historically of the founding of the state of Israel, whether it was or was not born in sin, the Jews are there. About 7.2 million of them live between the river and the sea, and they have created an astonishingly vibrant and creative society. They can't simply be driven out. Where would they go? At the same time, justice requires that the Palestinians, who also live in the land between the river and the sea, should be given the right to self-determination. They number about 5.7 million west of the Jordan, and 8.4 million if we include those displaced into Jordan. In other words, larger in number than the Jewish population of the state of Israel. This is why I personally see no realistic alternative to the so-called two-state solution, and I'd hope to be able to justify my support for that solution on good general Christian grounds. But I would find it difficult to justify it by discerning in the state of Israel as it now stands the outworking of some special purpose of God. This puts me at odds, of course, with Christian Zionism in both its restorationist and dispensationalist forms. I would find it difficult to accept the literalist hermeneutic of biblical prophecy, which underpins both these views. Both restorationism and dispensationalism envisage the conversion of the Jewish people and their acknowledgement of Jesus as their Messiah. Restorationism classically placed that conversion prior to their going up to the land, whereas dispensationalism places it after the return, which crucially allowed dispensationalists to identify the return under Zionism in 1948, which was manifestly a return in unbelief, with the return prophesied in Scripture. In fact, restorationism, as Donald Lewis has rightly noted, increasingly played down the aspect of conversion, till by the time of the First Zionist Congress in 1897, it had effectively disappeared. Both sides were prepared to see Zionism and the founding of the State of Israel as clear signs that the ancient prophecies were being fulfilled. Both envisaged the Jews as ultimately converting. So in a sense, the Zionist Jerusalem could be seen as in the end morphing into the heavenly Jerusalem. The position would be uncannily reminiscent of the position adopted by religious Zionists, namely that the present state, while not the redemption itself, is the beginning of the redemption, even though the redemption is very differently understood on the Jewish and the Christian side. And there remains what to do with the state in the meantime. And here I find the unwavering support of Christian Zionism for right-wing Jewish nationalism and its continuing refusal to address its oppression of the Palestinian people as indefensible, both in Old Testament and in New Testament terms. And here I would see the need, as did the writer of the Hebrews, facing the Jewish nationalism of his day, to hold up the alternative ideal of the heavenly Jerusalem of Hebrews 12. In taking this line, I find myself also at odds with more moderate Christian opinion, such as that of the Catholic theologian Gavin da Costa, who has made a notable attempt to construct from a Catholic perspective a Christian theological appraisal of Zionism. Again, like me, he finds it difficult to suppose that the Jewish people do not have some special role to play in the future purposes of God. I think it's quite clear that Paul thought they did in Romans 9 to 11. And he sees the state of Israel, which has become so inextricably bound up with the identity of the Jewish people, as having some part to play in this. He calls his position minimal Catholic Zionism. I think he formed his views before October the 7th, and I am not sure how he has dealt with events since then. But as I said earlier, the way that the state of Israel has responded to that terrorist attack has proved revelatory for many and has laid bare a dark potential at the heart of the Zionist project. Only time will tell, but I have a sinking feeling that it has been a game changer. Attitudes towards Israel will never be the same again. If one posits a special role for the Jewish people in the purposes of God, then contrary to what many Jewish leaders will insist, we will have to make a distinction between the people of Israel and the state of Israel, and recognize that the people's destiny may not inevitably be exercised through statehood, at least statehood in its present form. In arguing in this way, we would in effect be picking up a strand of thinking within Judaism, which is gathering some strength at the moment, and which is now referred to by some scholars as post-Zionism. Let me briefly expound a version of this, which actually predates the rise of modern political Zionism. It is found in 19th century Reform Judaism. Reform Judaism saw the Jewish people as having a noble role to play in history, namely to mediate the knowledge of the one true God, the creator of heaven and earth, to humankind. It viewed the national phase of that history of the people in ancient Israel as a preparation for its universal role. It regarded the scattering of the people in the diaspora in a positive light as actually helping to fulfill that mission. And it does not look for a return to Zion and to statehood at the end of history. Reform Judaism had later to face the realities of Zionism, the growing presence of Jews in Palestine, and finally the declaration in 1948 of the state. Broadly speaking, it offered qualified support for statehood, partly on the grounds that Israel provided a place of refuge for Jews fleeing the Holocaust, and partly because it saw the possibility that Israel, if it developed in a certain way, might actually help the Jewish people achieve their universal mission. This latter view chimed in with a strand of idealist Zionism, which sought to develop the nascent state as a light to the Gentiles, or la goyim. That idealism was more prominent in the early decades of the state, but it has been eclipsed more recently by right-wing chauvinism and nationalism. It is still there. There is plenty of opposition within Israel to the policies and actions of the present state, but it does not have its hands, this opposition does not have its hands on the levers of power. Christians, and particularly Christian churches, in trying to negotiate the hazardous shoals of the current fraught situation, need to be alert to the fierce internal debates within the Jewish community over Zionism and the state of Israel and their relationship to Judaism, and be prepared to align themselves with specific parties to those debates, and not simply accept the pronouncements of leading spokespeople and apologists for the community and for the state of Israel. Some apologists for Israel are quick to hurl the charge of anti-Semitism at critics of Israel. Indeed, some have been trying to argue that anti-Zionism is simply a form of anti-Semitism, to collapse one into the other, and have used the loosely drafted IHRA definition to make this case. This charge looks much less plausible if the Christian position aligns with a position within the Jewish community and within Israel. There is one final point that I need to make, and it is this. How can I defend myself against the charge that my position is supersessionist? Indeed, supersessionism on steroids, as one of my friends said to me. Supersessionism is sometimes glossed as replacement theology, that Christianity has totally replaced Judaism. You know this term, you're aware of it. It's a very fraught term these days. Christians have become highly sensitive to the charge of supersessionism. Supersessionism has become as much a cardinal sin in Christian thought as anti-Semitism, and indeed is sometimes seen as a manifestation of anti-Semitism. Some scholars are busily rewriting their commentaries on the New Testament writings, including the letter to the Hebrews, to try and give it a non-supersessionist reading. In my view, a huge muddle has developed here. I haven't the time now to try and unpick it, but let me make a few points. First, there is supersessionism and supersessionism. There are hard and soft versions of supersessionism. Hard forms would include a rejection of the Old Testament as having any relevance to Christians today, and would speak of Judaism today in highly pejorative terms. That is the sort of supersessionism one finds at its most extreme in the 2nd century Gnostic writer Marcion, but also in the epistle to Barnabas, which was probably written within 20 years of the epistle to the Hebrews. But that is not the view of the letter to the Hebrews. Its position is much softer. It asserts a continuity between the Old Testament and the New. It advocates cherishing and studying the Old Testament because the Old Testament provides the fundamental categories needed to interpret correctly the death of Christ, and Loveday demonstrated this abundantly this morning. The church understood this and made the Old Testament Christian scripture and assigned it a prominent place in its liturgy. Hebrews sees the work of Christ as perfecting, very favorite word of the writer to the Hebrews, as perfecting the Old Covenant. Now, that language does not cut much ice with Jews, who tend to see it as simply as a way of dressing up replacement theology. But it matters hugely for Christian theology. We must ask our Jewish friends to accept that it is a fundamental tenet of Christianity that God's supreme revelation to humanity came with Christ. And we should not be asked to compromise on this. We must equally respect their right to reject this point of view and not question their integrity when they do so, even when that rejection is expressed, as it is, alas, from time to time, in language as unacceptable as Christians have used against Judaism. There's a recent development which has muddied the waters of this debate still further. It is the realization that in the history of Judaism, supersessionism is actually not confined to Christianity. Yaakov Yadgar, whom I mentioned earlier, he's professor of Israel studies at Oxford, an Israeli. Yaakov Yadgar has argued that, given the revolutionary character of modern Zionism, its discontinuity with traditional Judaism, it can be seen as supersessionist. And he draws an explicit analogy with Christian supersessionism. The grounds on which Orthodox Judaism rejected 19th century Reform Judaism could be seen as supersessionist, though the term itself had yet not been invented. Orthodox critics frequently accused Reform as being a Christianized form of Judaism. If I were to set my mind to it, I think I could make a reasonable case for post-70 rabbinic Judaism being supersessionist, vis-a-vis the Judaism that went before, despite its trumpeting of its constant continuity. Once we begin to see this, then we are left wondering whether supersessionism is a category which has outlived its usefulness. Now, I see my time is up. We have covered much ground in both our lectures, and there's much more that could be said. But let me conclude by reiterating the basic point which we have been trying to make. The letter to the Hebrews, to many readers, seems to be a particularly rebarbative text, difficult, unacceptable, with little of use to say to us today. What we have tried to show is that actually, if read in the right way, it remains remarkably relevant and offers us wisdom to address pressing problems of our own troubled world. Thank you.